Thorin versus Reddit, episode 10. You know the drill by now, so let's bang this mother out, as I always used to tell the girls in Korea. So, first comment. 252 points. It was in a thread that was about Team Liquid when they were on a loss streak this split, and saying that even Mark Z and Skara had hopped off the Piglet hype train. And this guy, 252 points, says, I mean, for a supposed world-class ADC, he has been rather meh for a long time now. Now, the problem here, obviously, is the guy doesn't expand and say what he means by meh, I mean, in what context, and what he means for a long time now. Because the long time now part is the confusing aspect, right? Because even a year ago, Piglet was absolutely one of the best AD carries in the entire West, if not bordering on the world, when it was spring 2016 in Season 6 and he was on Team Liquid. He was the main carry of that team, and it was young Dardoch who was still developing, who was the other potential star. And in amongst that team, yeah, they still had Phoenix, who was pretty decent. And other than that, though, it was rookies. And he was the main reason why they're a team who were one game away from making the final of that split, with arguably a worse lineup in terms of talent than they'd had in previous seasons, actually, even going right back to Curse. That's the thing I don't understand about this sort of comment, is that this just looks like what people nowadays people use the term recency bias, like to mean, you know, people just having an undue bias to what's happened more recently. This seems like a ridiculous example of it, because during his tenure in the LCS, barring that first split where he had those personality issues, or he hadn't integrated into the team and he had kind of a ridiculous attitude, barring that, Piglet has consistently, we're talking like 3-4 splits in a row, been arguably the best AD carry in the LCS. The only reason last split I gave the title over to Doublelift is because, first of all, obviously all the shit went down on Team Liquid. They bumped Piglet down to Challenger, and he wasn't even playing in LCS at one point in time after they'd fucked around with the whole Dardoch Piglet, which one are we going to stick with? And then when you put him on a Challenger team, yeah, in that environment, without that competitive kind of drive of playing the best players and playing the big show matches on stage, I think that's what sapped him and just made him stop giving a fuck. I mean, you went and saw some of the stuff in the Breaking Point where he just didn't seem like he cared, and people said all that stuff like, oh no, now he's in a great place, and yeah, he's liking his teammates and stuff in that documentary. Like, no, that wasn't the Piglet that you wanted to see. One of the good things about Piglet, it comes with a negative, is that he's a very driven person, and he doesn't want to just succeed as a team. He starts with his own perspective. He wants to smash lane, he wants to succeed himself, and that drive, I think, through what were essentially on paper at times good Team Liquid rosters, but were very troubled organizationally, and they always lacked for a good shot caller. I think he did his job above and beyond the Call of Duty, both for an AD carry and for a Korean import. He's one of the best Korean imports we have ever seen, in as much as he was amazing in Korea, and he's also really had a second wind to his career, a second chapter, an epilogue to that championship phase in SK Telecom. It didn't just end, oh, he went to the West, and, you know, like some of the players that came over to the West, just did okay and petered out. No, he didn't get the results. He didn't get to an LCS final. He didn't win LCS, but he played incredibly as the AD carry position. And I thought in late Season 5, early Season 6, this guy was incredibly good, because he was working with supports who were really flawed. Special really didn't look so good towards the end of his time in Team Liquid. Then you go over and you look at Matt. Matt really benefited from playing a couple of champions and just being new to the LCS. Once expectations were on him, he really faded away. He had confidence issues. He couldn't, whatever reason, personality-wise, match with Piglet. Like, it seems like Piglet's aggressive alpha personality, at least in game, maybe corroded some of Matt's confidence in that respect. Therefore, he probably wasn't the right lane partner for him. But in spite of all these problems, Piglet was incredibly good. Now, coming to this split, yeah, the Team Liquid team is a train wreck right now. Losing Dardoch was the worst thing that ever happened to them. And then you add in, obviously he did just give up being AD carry and go straight up and go to be a mid laner. But the idea that this half a split or so that he plays an AD carry defines how he's been for a long time and shows that he's been meh, I don't get it. Like, I never got it back in Season 5, because in Season 5, I thought in summer of that season, Piglet was hard carrying. He was fucking insanely good at times in that game, and he was the one player you could always almost rely on to get leads, to get advantages, and then it was on the others and the lack of shot calling that they weren't always able to close it out, make it deep in the playoffs. I don't understand this perspective at all, and it goes without saying, as usual, despite this comment having 252 points, it is just a rank opinion from someone we don't know, with no basis given to it, no explanation, no explication of what's going on. He doesn't say like, oh, he was meh in as much as, you know, he didn't fit with his team and he didn't seem like he understood the meta champions, or for a long time. He doesn't say, oh yeah, actually I always thought he was a bit overrated in those areas when the team was good, and actually he didn't fit the current style of Eddie. He didn't give any reasons, basically. He just said he's been meh for a long time, and people are like, yep, I agree with that post. Ding, 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 ding. Like, fucking hell. Is this not supposed to be a place for discussion? Is it just supposed to be, let's see whose opinion is the most well-liked and popular? Obviously, rhetorical question. So, this was in a thread about, it was where, let's see, wrong one. It was about Keith and Haunter in a 1v1. And obviously, we all know it's going to be about AD carries when this comes up. So even though it's about Keith and Haunter, this comment has 146 points, and it's about Doublelift. It says, I remember Doublelift even commenting that Keith will become a great AD carry. Keith is just so puzzling, seeing as how he was able to reach rank 6 in Korea in 23 days during the Echo Fox bootcamp. Maybe he's just a good solo queue player? But that just makes it even more weird, seeing as how his misplays are legit gold level, getting hooked repeatedly by Nort in teamfights. Proofs that he didn't dynamic queue or duo to get to rank 6, seeing as how there's now a common misconception that he duoed all the way there when he mainly played solo. And then the guy gives some proof of that by linking to some threads to suggest that he played in a solo meta. Right, so first and foremost, in terms of the aspect that somehow him having this very good rank on the Korean solo queue is what makes it baffling that he's not so good in competitive. Now, people have gone over many, many times how different solo queue is. I mean, obviously, primarily in solo queue, you do still play for yourself and you play for your own advantages, and there's not going to be the same macro. And in fact, if you are a foreigner like Keith and you play on the Korean solo queue, there will be no shot calling whatsoever, essentially. You won't be able to stand what they're typing. You just play, and you basically all are trying to play as though you were computers playing correct League of Legends. So whatever your understanding as League of Legends is, you just play that out and you hope that you get teammates that works with. So, okay, it is impressive to a degree that he got that high, because sure, there have been Westerners who haven't gotten super high, and they were good players, actually, some of them. But I always give this example whenever people brag about Korean solo queue. I say that there are examples where someone consistently got very high, and it didn't necessarily say they were an incredible player. So Ambition is one of the best mid laners in the history of League of Legends. But you go back 3 years to Season 4, and already as a mid laner, he's starting to degrade a bit. He's still like good in an LCK level, but he's nowhere near elite anymore. And in fact, him losing out the matchup or being outperformed by the other mid laner typically was what got that Blaze team, which still had Flame, still had Emperor, etc. It's typically what got them eliminated and cost them those extra 1 or 2 games that could have made them 3rd place in LCK. Could have taken them to another LCK final. Obviously, it was OGN champions at the time, but same shit, whatever. Now, the point I'm making is, even during that era of time, when Ambition solo queued, he could consistently hit top 5, top 6, that sort of a rank on solo queue. In the era when Apto was going full on, Faker's fully there, you had all the Samsung players still in Korea. In that era, Ambition could consistently do that. And that, by the way, means that not only is a mid laner, but that means he's playing off roles and having enough success that he's staying on the hardest solo queue rank ladder in the world. He's consistently at an elite level. But it didn't translate into his play. And he's a veteran who knows the game massively and has played with some of those teammates for a long time and had something of a shot calling influence on the team and got to play the way he wanted to. So, first of all, the solo queue part isn't as baffling, actually. We've seen this kind of thing happen many, many times. I mean, famously in Europe, people like White Knight, who only just got his like real shot in LCK, in ULCS, a bunch of players like that have gotten to the number 1 in solo queue if they want to by grinding it out, or just have consistently gotten back to number 1. And when they have played in LCS, or they've played on any competitive level, have been nowhere near number 1 best player in Europe, as the rank was proportionately in EU West. So that part is irrelevant. Now, there's also the aspect that Doublelift commented that Keith will become a great AD carry. If you went back in time and made some sort of database of all of Doublelift's comments, and the reason there'd be a database is so we could tag it, okay, and we could assign it by player, and you pulled up a player, you would see almost every conceivable opinion on that player from Doublelift, especially AD carries. This is a trend I noticed a while back, and it's one of the reasons why I stopped putting a lot of stock in Doublelift's trash talk. Like, I think even he knows most of it's just for fun, and it's not even, sometimes he doesn't even mean the opinion he puts in there. Maybe it's just to hype a match, or to have a bit of fun, or to get back at someone who beat him in a game and he thinks he's better than them. Because when you actually look at his opinions across all mediums, so trash talk, pre-game interviews, post-game interviews, like interviews where it's like a sit-down one after the season when there's no games coming up, you get this massive variance, this massive spectrum of opinions, to the extent that, no joke, go look up old AD carries, go look up Chaos, and then I'm a Cutie Pie, and then Keith, and then who the fuck else has even played? Vasily, whatever, and you'll find periods, depending on which one it is, pre-game, post-game, after the season, reflections, like whatever, you'll find him saying that player's, oh, he's nothing, he's just garbage, oh, he's a liability, oh, he's pretty good actually, yeah, he's an alright player, I respect him, and then when they do well and beat him sometimes, and CLG was doing badly, this is one that I especially noticed, one of the things Doublelift would do is, after losses, suddenly he to seem to like, oh, I'm very contrite and remorseful, like I really got to improve. He'd be very humble there, except it didn't jive with his other opinions. So whereas he'd said that player was trash or below average before, now suddenly he'd be like, no, he did play well and he is a good AD carry. And actually, you know what, Sneaky is the best AD carry in the West. You know, some ridiculous comment like that. Like the variance is so ridiculous that picking out one instance of Doublelift saying something, not particularly relevant. Also, as a secondary point to that, Doublelift in general, I've never understood why people loved him on the analysis desk beyond the banter and the personality and expertise at AD carry, and a very specific type of AD carry style of play. Because for those aspects, I can totally understand why he's there, and I would put him on a desk. I think he's a great character. But in terms of overall game analysis, and in terms of being someone who can evaluate other players and who's a very shrewd thinker, I've never seen Doublelift in that category. In fact, I think he's quite far from that. And even if he's developed a little bit of that over the years, maturing, getting to know more about the game and the scene, I don't think he's particularly someone who you go to and think this is a good player for evaluating opponents and teammates and all the rest of it. You know, like I said, he's had a very, very varied set of opinions on even the same players over the years. It's not like those players were changing over the years. Sometimes within the same split, he'll give three drastically different opinions on the same player. So I don't really know what the relevance is there. Keith isn't particularly good, hasn't been for a long time, and very briefly was. If you even consider briefly being good possible. I don't really, personally. So this was a thread where it was the Thorin versus Loco episode, and it's the one where the premise was, this is like back in before the middle of the split of LCK, who would be better at the end of the split, SKT or KT Ralston. Now, interestingly enough, those two teams are in the final of LCK, and so, I mean, we're going to literally find out the actual practical answer to that experiment on Saturday. But this has 69 points, and it says, it's about my opinion that Wolf is boosted, and I think Bang is just overrated. I think he's a very good player, but I think he's overrated in a... Oh, I'll get into that. So, 69 points, it says, even if he, talking about me, stands in KT's side for the sake of it, your points should at least be relevant. Saying Bang and Wolf are boosted is clearly delusional. Now, there's something that you might need to understand about how to argue, okay? When you make assertions, you should bolster them with points. And you should give reasons, and in doing so, we should be able to understand the principle of how you thought to arrive at those conclusions. It's like doing a test. You don't just give the answer. You've got to give your workings out, and you've got to explain how you arrived there, and you've got to show the different parts, so that sometimes, even if the outcome isn't considered correct, we're talking about a test here, so something really can be correct or false, people might give you marks for, okay, some of the thinking did make sense in this. This guy has just basically made two assertions here, which is that the points should be relevant, but he has then listed none of my points or the relevancy of them and argued for or against them or the context of them. Then he has also asserted that saying Bang and Wolf are boosted is clearly delusional. That's it. He hasn't explained why it's delusional. He hasn't explained what makes Bang and Wolf not boosted. He also, and this is the funny part at the end, because remember, this is an upvoted comment, people agreed with this sentiment, even though it gave nothing. It was just an opinion. It's not an argument. The reason why I think this is a funny comment to highlight is because that last part where he says, saying Bang and Wolf are boosted is clearly delusional. Now, if you go and watch the video, or you watch any of my content I have ever produced, I didn't say Bang was boosted. That at no point was said in this video, hasn't been said in past videos. I don't even think I said that when he first kind of rose with SKT in Season 5. But I said Wolf is delusional. So what's great about this is, this guy hasn't even managed to correctly restate my opinion, which he is criticizing, but without giving any points for. And people praise him and reward him with upvotes for that. So this is in a thread. It was from one of the League of Legends reality shows for Team Liquid, and it has 19 points. And this is about Doublelift, because it was where Doublelift was joining the team. And it said it was about the context of Doublelift getting kicked out of his house by his family way back in the day before he joined CLG. And then he went to live with Travis famously after his Reddit post, which said he needed somewhere to live. He lived with Travis. He got on CLG. The rest is history to some degree. Became obviously a very popular player, a very good player, and has had a fantastic League of Legends career. So this 19 points comment says, except the fact that his family did kick him out of his home at first because he wanted to be an esports player. Not until he became so successful did his family know they should have trusted and had faith in their son. Now, first and foremost, this is absolutely inaccurate on some factual levels. Like, first of all, if you've ever gone, and I think there's one on Travis's channel, I'll link it there if I can, and heard the story of Doublelift getting kicked out of his home, the actual trigger point for Doublelift getting kicked out of his home, from what I remember, and I tend to have a pretty good memory of these things, was actually something along the lines of an argument with his mother over like eating the crust off a piece of bread and then leaving the bread or leaving the crust. One of the two. That legitimately was the trigger point for the argument that led to them saying, like, get out, him leaving, and then essentially never returning in terms of going back and live there as their son, but returning years later, and Travis did another video where to reunite with them, and finally now they've gotten over it as he's a successful pro in his career. Now, the kind of atmosphere behind that may well have been that Doublelift didn't focus on his studies, wasn't going to be someone who was going to become a doctor or a lawyer like a lot of Asian immigrant families want their son to become so they can succeed, but was playing games. And by the way, at the time he was playing games, there was no big money to be made in League of Legends. Even the best streamers like Hotshot GG at the time didn't make that much money. They made like a very almost like minimum wage for someone in their age group from that background in that sort of a world. Like, they didn't make great money. So at the time, he wasn't successful at the time, and there was no indication at the time he was going to actually. Like, he'd played, like, he'd been a support for Curse, and he'd been an AD carry at different points in times, but like on a lower level. And at the time, yes, he'd started to shine in solo queue, and people had seen he had talent. But it wasn't until he got this offer to go and join CLG, he was on a really good team, and now his talent's really shone. And remember, what was the key reason why he became fantastic? That he got partnered with Chowster. And Chowster was one of the most cerebral, best thinkers in the history of League of Legends. And back then, he might have been the best of everyone. He had the most experience, he played the most roles, and he had a really good read on what was the burgeoning League of Legends scene back then, which meant that at the time there wasn't even there'd only just become a set meta of the roles you play. And in terms of what you could do and the summoner spells you could take and the different tricks you could do and the different picks you could do in different comps, it was wide open. It was a wild west. And in was he coming like an entrepreneur, like one of those robber baron guys coming in and just setting up a business and very successful, and was making fantastic deals all the time in the metaphor that I'm giving there. So without Chowster, without joining CLG, which didn't happen at the time he was kicked out, there's no saying Doublelift ever even makes it to kind of degree that he did now and becomes a global superstar. Also, without getting kicked out, how does he meet Travis? How does he become friends with Travis? And remember, it's not just that Doublelift became a superstar and was a fantastic player, which he was when he got with Chowster, but it's that part of why he has been so huge as well is that having a friendship with a central media figure in League of Legends like Travis has meant Doublelift's done more interviews than anyone else. He's done tons of post-game, pre-game, intimate ones. He's got a friend there who's working with him, so his friend knows how to get interesting information out of him and how to get the good comments that they've talked about privately and which one of those can come out. So he has had a lot of help that actually, funnily enough, in some senses was triggered by him being kicked out. So you can't look back with hindsight now and go like, these idiots, like, first of all, they kicked him out for wanting to be an esports player. Not actually accurate at all. That's in no way accurate. You've entirely mischaracterized what his family did there. You're completely speaking out of school because you don't know what you're talking about. You've just heard that yourself, most likely, second or third hand or fourth hand or fifth hand or 55th hand, considering we're on Reddit now, like 5 years after all this shit went down. And even worse than that, the part that says, not until he became so successful did his family know they should have trusted him, had faith in their son. They shouldn't have trusted and had faith in their son. As I've just outlined there, it was touch and go that he would ever be a very successful player. He might have just kept playing if he'd stayed as their son and they trusted and believed in him as just like one of those wildly erratic, like skilled. He could have been essentially like Woolite, like some skill. Obviously, he had more skill than Woolite, but skilled in some senses. And then famously, Doublelift was the guy who just flashed in and got his head banged in a team fight where you need your AD carry to kite and be incredibly careful of CC. He's the guy where he could have been one of those guys who was so erratic, he'd have a little career and he'd play for some of the lower teams, a Man or a Cole, or the teams that we had back then, Team 8 later. But no one says he'd ever be an LCS champion. No one says he'd ever go to Worlds and have all the fantastic success he had from partnering with Travis, building his rep, getting with Chowster, getting experience and getting taught the game, joining CLG, one of the biggest orgs at the time, and then having them invest in him and trust in him for years and years when the rest of the org to some degree went to shit. No, that is not something you could trust and have faith in. Then you've got to also add in that the fact that he made it doesn't mean that every boy with the talent of Doublelift in a second or third generation immigrant family from China should then be trusted and given opportunity to argue with their parents, be insubordinate, not discuss things in a reasonable manner, not focus on school at all, the only thing that they know about the world that can help you succeed, and then just go off and play games all day and say, oh, I'm doing pretty well, and somehow you should just trust them completely. Guess what? That will lead to a lot of fucked up futures for a lot of kids, and all on the basis that Doublelift's the one that made it. He is a massive exception to the rule, and he back then wasn't the Doublelift he is now. So he is even more of an exception to the rule when you consider the circumstances under which he left back then. That is ludicrous to imagine that you should just trust in him in that particular sense. There's also the fact that it's also not just on his family, it's on Doublelift as well as to why that didn't work out. First of all, if you're going to be someone who's lazy and won't do your work and won't apply yourself in other areas, you got to give up a little bit, right? You got to say, yeah, sorry, mum and dad, I know I'm not really doing things the way you want. He was someone who, admittedly, I think he's even said himself, he was argumentative. He's a guy who was stubborn, and we saw this, it's something that he's had to work on a lot in his career ever since then. Then you've got to add in, as a kind of a last factor, that this, since the trigger point I pointed out was a stupid argument, and the circumstances of them kicking him out wasn't like, we philosophically disagree with you doing esports, therefore cast you out to the street, never darken my door again. That's not the way it went at all. Part of it was they kicked him out because of this trigger point, this blow up. But I think if you went and asked him now, if you'd have come back a month later and said, I'm sorry about that, I'll try a bit harder at school and I'll play a little bit less of games and, I'll try and work on my attitude in argument. I think my own speculation, knowing him for a while, knowing the circumstances, having heard it recounted many times in interviews and features, I think in that scenario, his family would take him back in. It's not as though they said, get away and never come back. Now, the fact that he did have a little bit of fame in esports, and then Travis was available there, and all this stuff then happened that was wonderful in the months following that, allowed him to never have to go back and succeed at this level, means that now the story seems really extreme, like he never could have done that, and they'd cast him out to go absolutely to the bottom of society, and he would have to fight his own way back, and he was homeless, and all this. He was never really homeless. I think he spent like half a day before he had an apartment to stay in or something mad like that. He was staying with a friend, and then he had a couple of days where he went to Travis's, and then from then on he had a home. So that's so exaggerated. And then the idea that this random pleb on Reddit is just going to see, parents of this kid, you should know better. You don't even know the fucking details now in 2017, and he's only done about 1 billion interviews and 700 features about the shit. So this is a thread. Same thread. This is going to be about the old Doublelift again then, I guess. So 132 points. This guy says, Double is the star of the show on every team he plays on. The camera loves him. And then the reply to that, 89 points, says, it helps that he's developed a really good camera personality. He speaks very clearly. It's both casual and eloquent with little of the ums and likes that are common among other players. Right, first of all, the idea that the camera loves him. Yes, there's something even about Doublelift's sort of demeanor, because in one sense it's awkward, but it can be quite intense. And then he's very it's funny that people often say Asians aren't as emotive, but actually perhaps from living in a West Coast culture, he's basically American to me. He's very emotive. I mean, the way he reacts, and he's so odd. This is the kind of electric personality that the camera does attract, and that people want to see, and it's compelling in that sense. Then there's the background story. That means people want to know what's going on with him. And then the fact that his emotional his erratic emotional nature ties into his fantastic skills, not always directly so you could graph it. Sometimes it's almost opposite in terms of when he's up, but then the team's doing badly, but he believes he should have won the game. And so that's all incredibly exciting stuff. It's all very, very appealing. It's all going to compel people to follow you. But this part where it says that he speaks very clearly and he is both casual and eloquent. Now, I know quite a few people who I'd consider eloquent speakers. I know people who have very deep vocabularies, who can explain something in a very concise manner, or who can tease apart a very difficult and abstract concept into simpler language, or break it into components so that you can piece it back together and kind of get a grasp for it. Doublelift can't do any of that. to my knowledge. Now, he can speak casually, and he has improved his speaking, but first of all, he has had more interview experience than any other pro gamer I know in the modern era. Like, maybe really old school players like Heaton or Grubby who've done a million interviews, maybe they have more than him. But in League of Legends, he legitimately might have done 200 video interviews. If you add in talk shows, maybe we're getting up to like 300 or something crazy. Not only that, most of them with a close friend of his who he's talked to many times, who understands the rhythm of and understands him and how to get the best out of him. So the idea that he's incredible in this sense, he isn't, and that's after more experience than everyone else. Like, someone like N-Rated might have done 20 interviews ever, and this guy's ungodly fantastic at speaking and eloquent and thoughtful and insightful and knows how to make a point in a way where it can be understated, and yet the impact is incredible when you mull it over. No. Let's not exaggerate here. Doublelift has developed, certainly. First of all, when he first started interviews, he was fucking terrible. He's someone who was all over the place. He'd made the classic mistake of speaking as fast as you can, and then speaking as fast as you can paired with as fast as you thought the thought in your mind. So as a result, if you remember the way he used to speak, and he does it to some degree now when he's not kind of comfortable, what he would do is he'd say the first part of the sentence or the first sentence very rapidly. Like, I don't know, dude. I think like he's kind of, and then it's like you could see where that's where the thought had ended, and he hadn't put the next one together yet, and there'd be a pause as though he was lagging, be like, and then sometimes like his eyes would dart around, then he'd. Yeah, but I don't know, maybe, and then just go off and so on. And as a result, actually, it wasn't particularly relevant. It wasn't that casual, actually. It took a lot of time for him to develop more so than this. And you still see when he talks, he does that thing where halfway into a sentence or between one sentence and the other, he sort of like looks around in his brain. He sometimes completely recalculates, configures the whole thing, and goes the opposite way on what he was just saying. It's actually quite jarring when you talk to him, like, this guy's all over the place. Has he really thought that out? Is that really what he thinks? Is that just something off the top of his head? A lot of the time, seems like the latter, right? So this was in a thread where Monte Cristo, one of his Monty's musings, was talking about watchability across esports games. And obviously he was pointing out, Overwatch has some real teething, growing problems in that particular respect. And so he was contrasting it against League of Legends and CSGO. And he came to the conclusion, by the way, that CSGO is probably the most watchable, which I think many people who are esports industry veterans would agree upon. So this comment has 34 points. And it says, I have a different opinion as to the difficulties of watching MOBAs. When Monty says that the reason MOBAs have a high viewership is due to player base, I actually disagree. I think that what makes the viewership higher is the similarity between playing and watching. In LOL, you are watching from the same camera angle that you play with, and in other games, the camera angle changes constantly. I have played CSGO for about 300 hours on Steam, for about 300 hours, Steam says, and I still have no clue what is going on in competitive. It's still enjoyable to watch for me, but the constant camera swaps make it hard to tell who is dying and where the players are at. I think watching FPS games is like learning a whole other skill, and it doesn't translate from playing to watching. Okay, so on the latter part about how he's played 300 hours of CSGO, yet he doesn't understand very basic things because of camera swaps to different POVs, like who is dying and where players are, that is baffling to me. Like, that legitimately, like, here's the thing, I'm not going to say this guy's an outright idiot. Maybe his brain just suits MOBA games better, but that he is an extreme exception in that respect. Almost everyone I've ever encountered, especially people in esports and casuals, have had the opposite experience. They don't even have to have played CSGO to very quickly pick up on who is dying and on who's killing them. Now, the key detail he doesn't add here is, he says he's played 300 hours of CSGO. He doesn't bother to mention whatsoever how many games he watched. Like, if he's watched 2 games, this opinion, I'd love him to say at the beginning, because I'd stop reading the opinion. I wouldn't waste my fucking eyes and my mind reading the rest of it, because that's something about people commenting on Overwatch games. If you've watched 2 or 3 Overwatch games, your opinion is of almost no value to me whatsoever. You haven't even spent any time getting adjusted to it. When I watched the first NFL game, I thought, this is boring. These rules make no sense. Yeah, because it didn't make sense to me, because I hadn't learned the fucking game. I hadn't attuned myself to it. I hadn't learned reference points of what is a good run, what is a good throw, is that easy, is that hard? It was me that had to learn. The game didn't have to change itself. The game's a fantastic game. I was the one who was the ignorant one, but people apparently can just watch 3 or 4 games, and if they don't instantly get it, then that game is not watchable. It's too difficult to watch for casuals. No, it's too difficult to watch for rank fucking amateurs. A casual isn't someone who just watches the game once. It's someone who watches the game, just not to a hardcore level. They watch it every now and then. Now, in terms of the part where he says that he thinks MOBAs are easy to watch because the angle's the same, that's not a bad point, actually. I think the angle being the same is an interesting point, and it does help in League of Legends that at least it's vaguely similar, and as a result, you recognize kind of the layout. But there's also the fact that I actually think that applies to sports and is underrated. One of the problems with some of the esports games is that we've never figured out what the good set of angles are still. It's still a work in progress in that respect. Because one of the things I love about the NBA, actually, is that the NBA, I mean, hockey's like this as well, they've really figured out, because it's the same in every stadium where they put the cameras, that camera line. And so as a result, I've been watching the NBA, I've watched like 30 years worth of the NBA, maybe 40. And it's true, actually, by the way, in the 80s and the 70s, the angle was a little bit lower. But the angle that they have for the basket means that I can judge as soon as someone shoots it if that ball's going in or not. And I can tell based on the distances how the spacing is. But that's because I've seen the game for so many years from pretty much the exact same angle every time. And that is a key component that's underrated. You don't think of it how the frame composition is, but that does very much affect how I enjoy the game and how well my own expertise to the game can develop without having played a lot of basketball myself. Now, in terms of the part where he puts, Monty says that the reason MOBAs have a high viewership is due to player base, and he disagrees, right? It's irrelevant. What, I don't know if he actually means this, but he has some points with his aspect about the angle, but angle being the same as players doesn't in any way stand as a primary factor accounting for why MOBAs have huge numbers. Now, here's what's funny. A game like Dota 2 has something like twice as many viewers relative to number of players than League of Legends does. So that factor doesn't make a lot of sense there, does it? That doesn't correlate with the data. Now, I actually agree with Monty that what's funny is when he says has high viewership, he means high viewership in an objective sense. If you look at just the number of viewers in League of Legends, it is higher at times than CSGO and other esports games. So it has high viewership due to, and the reason he's saying due to high player base, this is the part that's counterintuitive. He doesn't mean that most people who play the game watch it. No, that's the funny thing. He's actually saying what I've said many times. League of Legends is a terrible esports game in terms of converting casual players into esports viewers. It's low. Its ratio is way lower than those other popular esports games. So actually, he's essentially saying it only has higher viewership due to having masses more players than everyone else. And as a result, what's the carry-on point? Think about why he would be making that point. Because he's making the point that League of Legends isn't actually that easy a game to watch or to understand, or even perhaps as enjoyable a game to watch for casual viewers, which is hence why when he's ranking the games on watchability, he's listing it lower and listing games like CSGO higher. You got to look at the person's context before you argue against it. Otherwise, in this case, you've almost made his point for him indirectly because it hasn't got high viewership relative to its own player base. So, right, here's a good comment. This is in the one where Zyrene was talking about developing his caster persona. Now, this has 304 points, and I'll skip the first part, but he says this. He says, I really, really love Zyrene's comments on appreciation threads. They really shouldn't devolve into snide comments towards other casters. And we're all, including myself, somewhat guilty for thinking this way. And unfortunately, these casters are public personas with their work being up to interpretation of entire community that enjoys LCS broadcasts. Nobody likes to be compared to their co-workers publicly, particularly when the public community pushes down the co-worker to raise you up. That's awkward. Thanks for the great work, Zyrene. Now, I actually agree with this comment, by the way, in general. I think as a general gist, I'm on board with the sentiment. I would say this. First of all, I think it is fine to compare casters. So, for example, if you're talking about how good Zyrene is, then you probably do need to put him in the context of other people who are color commentators or analysts and say, I prefer Zyrene to Jat. I think Zyrene is better at communicating. I think his grasp on the game both explains it to a casual viewer, but also shows he's done his homework and researched it and perhaps talked to the player to get their perspective. Now, if you do that, that's good, because notice he did contrast it against the other person and imply that the other person is not as good, but the focus was largely still on the positives and what he likes about this guy. That's a healthy and, in my opinion, productive way to contrast them, and I think you, to some degree, should contrast them or have a good discussion. The problem is this: if it goes the other way, and he's like, I like Zyrene, he's better than Jat, because the thing with Jat is, it's so boring the way he always goes on, and he's obviously so biased to TSM anyway, and plus he has that smug look on his face where Zyrene's a good guy, whereas Jat sometimes seems like a piece of shit. Like, you can see how that's not in any way productive. It's not even good analysis or critique of Jat, actually. The thread isn't about Jat in that scenario, it's an appreciation thread for Zyrene. So how about make Zyrene the topic of the thing, and you can imply as much that he's better in some sense, but it's different to talk about why someone's better as opposed to why someone's worse. Now, a last point I want to make on this is one thing that I think is totally inappropriate is The people who, there's an appreciation thread about a person, and they go into it, and they start trying to debate or make points as to why the person the appreciation thread is about isn't good. They want to downplay him or outright insult him and say he's shit and he's bad and argue against people who think they're good. To me, that sort of person is just a grade A asshole. Like, I would actually legitimately suggest either there's something going wrong in their life that's triggering them to behave this way online, or perhaps they have developed some sort of mental illness. I don't mean like a very, very serious one. I mean some sort of low-level neurosis that is now manifesting where they feel the need to like, people are congratulating someone I don't like. Nah, I'll go and tell them what he's really like. Like, there's something mentally ill about that to me. Like, there's many, many threads on the internet that have a neutral topic or aren't explicitly appreciation threads where you can say all those things about that person if you really are that kind of guy who wants to do that. But the idea that a thread specifically about praising the person or talking about what's good about them and appreciating them, you go in there and then shit on the person, to me, that's not just rude. Like, that just kind of says something about you as a person, really. Like, that's really kind of shitty. And I realize, by the way, in saying this, it's a waste of effort for me to say that because the sort of person who does that isn't going to listen to this and go, yeah, good point, I won't do that anymore. They're going to do it anyway. I'm just saying that's how I frame them. That's the context I put them in, because they're not just making a comment or just expressing free speech and just doing it in this particular sense. It's like if someone had a book club, right? And they said, every Tuesday we'll have a book club for Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. And then I go around there and I sit there, and then when everyone starts saying, what I really loved was the way the dream logic kind of has a magical quality to it, and at times it alludes to things in history, and I go, you know what? I think James Joyce was a piece of shit. I think he slept with whores, therefore he's a man of low character. I think everyone who likes his book is an idiot, and I think actually I want to start talking now about Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Like, that would be inappropriate, and they rightfully and appropriately would ask me to leave, and arguably, if I refuse to, should eject me at that point in time. So there is a difference between free speech, especially in a neutral or a public setting, and what is essentially a discussion where the terms are fairly set and it's inappropriate and no one actually wants to hear that sort of communication there. Now, it's Reddit, you can say what you want, but that's my thought on it. So, this was one where the Vici Gaming owner had contrasted Bengi and Dandy, because they're obviously two world champion junglers that he'd recruit to his team, and he'd made a comment along the lines of like, well, you get what you paid for, and Bengi wasn't as good as Dandy was the implication. So this comment has 400 points, 408, and unfortunately this person is a classic example of not only a butthurt fan, but legitimately a raged, bordering on mentally ill, obsessive fan. The way this is phrased and the way they think, and by the way, this person posted dozens of comments on this topic, and they all were like incredibly emotionally aggressive in this manner, and as though the person was just a teenage girl lashing out at the world who'd implied that like her favorite pop singer isn't the best singer, That's like the kind of way she was going, how dare you say that, he's a great guy. Like, listen to this fucking comment. Can't believe he blames the low performance of VG on Bengi. This is not what he deserves. You get what you paid for. Seriously, this clearly tells us how this CEO thinks of their players and how they are treated. I just can't believe that CEO is blaming Bengi for their performance. Does he ever watch their game? No wonder why Bengi looks so weary these days. The CEO stays with them all day long. At least that's what he said in his apology, saying how much he tries. Thinking that you get what you paid for. Now we just want Bengi back. We want him in a place where he gets respected as a person, as a player, as what he's done, as how much he makes efforts. He plays solo queue till 5 a.m. these days, as when he was in SKT showing bad performance. He was always putting his full effort to do his best and is still. Vici Gaming just doesn't deserve players like Bengi, very disrespectful towards their players. Like, you can see in this almost had nothing to do with Bengi or the CEO. I mean, it had a little bit of detail about Bengi, apparently practices a lot still. It had almost nothing to do with Bengi's situation or the CEO. It was just about, like, laying out a fucking view into this person's mental state and how they think about this player. This isn't even just a player they like or a player they're a fan of. They are almost obsessively, emotionally attached to them, as though we were talking about their brother. As though we were talking about someone who's a very, very close friend of theirs, and they just couldn't hold it in anymore due to the way they'd been attacked. Now, first of all, the Vici Gaming guy saying that, it's bad PR, it's ill-advised, but actually, when you've paid as much money, and when you've taken a massive chance on a world champion Korean, and they come in and they're not that good and they don't work that well with your team, I don't think that's actually unreasonable for that person to then suggest, like, well, you get what you paid for, didn't you? I had Dandy before, he was pretty good, and now I've gotten Bengi and I didn't pay, because remember, part of it was if they'd pay as much for Dandy again. Well, I've gotten Bengi, well, yeah, you get what you paid for, so I'm kind of just having to deal with what we got because the team had a very bad performance. Now add into that all the shit about this is how he obviously thinks the whole time. Like, at this point, not only is this person behaving in a very erratic and irrational manner, but this is just so incredibly childish, the way they conceive of the world. It's like that thing where, because you don't like someone, they're not just someone who did something wrong or did something terrible. They're like 24/7 some comic book villain. Like the idea that the whole time the Vici gaming guy is there mistreating Bengi, and the whole time in his brain he's just thinking, this is what you get paid for, this is what you get paid for, this is what you get what you paid for, get what you paid for, Bengi shit, get what you paid for. And then Bengi's like, could I have what? Shut the fuck up! If I wanted to pay for you to drink water, then I wouldn't have fucking... Yeah, fucking Dundee didn't drink water, did he? Just existed on pure skill. Like, no, he wasn't doing that. That's unreasonable to even suggest as much, isn't it? What the fuck has that got to do with his comments here? Then the fact that, like, this is why Bengi looks so weary. Not the fact that he's tanking his whole career, right? Just lapping in some money at the end of it, and has been a fairly lackluster player for the last 2-3 years, if you include this year and probably what will happen in the next split. Then you've got to add in the idea that, like, they don't deserve Bengi. Like, he shouldn't have to be on a team like this. Bengi is on this team out of his own choice. A team that's had Koreans in the past, therefore he could have contacted them, asked them what it's like asked other Koreans around. He had choices of a bunch of different teams. He chose this team to get the highest dollar amount, to get paid way more salary than his skill level currently deserves. He was largely recruited for his name value as well, and in the hopes he could work some magic, but they were taking a big gamble on a player who went off the boil many years ago and hadn't looked good on SKT, except in those occasional big clutch games. Wasn't even the main jungler for SKT. They used Blank in something like 60 or 70% of their games in 2016. So... child please. The idea that this CEO who's paid for that essentially feels now like maybe I got a false bill of goods, and in fact what I got, yeah, that's what I should expect. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think this random pleb doesn't know fuck all about buying players, and I'm sure they'd spend all of their, if they had $1 million in the bank, they'd spend like $999,999 to buy fucking Bengi, but who gives a shit? Right, so this was a thread about Impact saying he was excited to lane against Flame in NA. And this has 208 points, and the guy says, I feel like teams are forced to run tank tops because tank junglers are so much weaker than damage dealers. If they can buff up Zac, Sejuani, or Rek'Sai, teams could play damage tops without being forced into a no-tank comp. Now, I actually think this is a very good point. It's one that I've made myself many times in the past. One of the areas in League of Legends which I feel is really unfair to the top lane and the jungle position is that people judge those players historically against all the other roles. They don't just judge them against other top laners or the junglers, and they don't even judge them in the context of the meta. They talk about who is the better jungler, and then they say this guy failed to adapt. They don't even always address that there are amazing tank top laners and there are amazing carry top laners, and sometimes the overlap isn't the same. Likewise for junglers. Peanut, if you put him on tanks, yeah, he's just a good to above average jungler. You put him onto damage dealers, he's a fucking monster. He might be the best jungler in the world at times. But a player like Score can play either sides of the equation, can play whatever's meta and can be fantastic. Who's the better jungler? We've got to look at the context. We've got to look at what's going on with the team. We've got to look at who he's got as his top laner, depending on how the switch is. Because the key thing is, it's gotten... since nowadays you can't get a support to build in off tank, essentially the need for tank, the fact that the tank and defensive shit is so OP in contrast to damage dealing, because damage dealing shit's always what gets nerfed, and the existence of garbage like fucking Ninja Tabi, which is actually just anti-fun in the game. Stuff like this existing forces, in general, the jungler or the top to be the tank. And even worse, when the meta is flipped, now suddenly... it switches as to who's who. And there are, as I said, not that many players who are incredibly good or equally good at both aspects, damage dealing and tank, at jungler or top lane. And so it massively contracts your success in a team because jungler and top's getting fucked with, and they can get fucked with separately. Like one of them might get a bonus because he goes to damage deals, but now the other guy can't play the tanks. So there is so many problems here. I think it's a very relevant point and a context that, unfortunately, as annoying as it might be to have to reiterate, must always be brought up when you discuss junglers and top laners as overall players, against every other player in the world and against players in history who played in different metas and different kind of in an era when you didn't have to have the tank in the same particular way. So this was a thread It was when Immortals played NALCS, and it's where Immortals was doing pretty well. So this comment has 65 points, and then it's replied to by a comment with 159 points. And it says, TSM must like having a handicap. And then the guy replies and says, not a nice thing to call Sven. Now, what's funny is, I'm sure there are many people out there who will decide now that they're outraged by that, and you cannot say that, and free speech should not cover this, and this person should be punished, except obviously they're just random Redditors, so you can't really punish them in any way. But I'll just say, that's hilarious. Now, is it the joke dark? Is it mean-spirited to a degree? Yeah, obviously. That's what some humour is like, and sometimes life calls for that, depending on what your personality is. But you know what? It's straight banter, and it's fucking hilarious, quite frankly. So this was the thread where it said that Wisdom was no longer part of Origin. So, I mean, that little rat got off that fucking sinking ship pretty quick, didn't he? So, 209 points. The guy says, I always wondered how Wisdom got so bad. At some point, he was substitute for a Worlds finalist. Yes, that is a fact. He was a substitute for a Worlds finalist. But what's the relevance there? What is the implication? The implication is that being a sub for a Worlds finalist means you can't be bad. Now, in the context of Korea, I always thought Wisdom was fairly bad. The fact that you had Wisdom swapping with the other guy, Lee, neither of them were particularly good, but at least Lee could like play the game and knew what the fuck he was doing to some degree. That they actually are he's a great example of someone who they just decided in the team to stick with him and didn't take someone else out of solo queue. So he never was good, even in the context, especially not in the context of Korea. And then the idea he was a sub for a World Finalist. Now, there is no implication there. There have been players in the World's Finals who weren't even, I'd argue, top 10 at their position. There have been players who've been subs for World Finals who shouldn't even have been playing in their league, who are objectively bad to some degree. So actually, it doesn't imply anything. Like the fact he was a World's Finalist, who gives a shit? Look at some of the players who played on Royal Club. Tabe was fucking terrible, and he got to the World's Finals. Now, the only reason he did that is because he played with Uzi I, he played with Whites. They were good players to different degrees. And at that one tournament, he figured out some OP shit, which was that like super aggro Annie support build. That's it. He was a terrible player. He wouldn't even be in my top 50 support players of all time. And he was a starter in a World's Finals. So the implication is not there at all, actually. So this was where Perks gave his thoughts on Worlds. And this had 26 points, and then the comment following it had 14. And the 26 points said, even after this Worlds, I am still impressed with this guy's achievements on his first year of being LOL Pro. Not a lot of pros can say they won 2 splits and made Worlds in their rookie year in LCS. This guy replies, 4 out of 5 Splice players are rookies that went from relegations to Worlds without buying a world-class bot lane or Korean imports, right? Not really relevant at all. This guy thinks he's made a relevant reply there, but he hasn't, because the fact that 4 out of the 5 Splice players are rookies and then went from relegations to Worlds, their accomplishments are nowhere near Perks. Because remember, Perks went to Worlds in his rookie split year and won LCS. And by the way, when he won that first LCS split, I don't give a fuck what anyone tells you about Trick. Perks was the MVP of the first LCS split, Spring Season 6. He was the best player on his team. Now go find me one of those Splice players that went from relegations to Worlds. And by the way, they went from relegations to Worlds. Okay, great. Right? Perks had to get into LCS. Is that not relevant? But find me one of those players who was as good as Perks in the splits. Or who went to Worlds and their accomplishment matched up to his, winning his region and then going to Worlds as well and going out in groups just like they did. So the idea that then, without buying a world-class bot lane or Korean imports, again, because he hasn't singled out any of the players or explained how they would have benefited from world-class bot lane or Korean imports, and also the idea they had a world-class bot lane. I mean, yeah, when they got Sven and Mithy, but remember, he won LCS with Emperor and Hybrid. So he won LCS and did better than Splice did before then, with Emperor, who was in no sense a world-class AD carry, and Hybrid was like a decent rookie, but was also a rookie, and actually didn't show much beyond that. In fact, he just looked like shit like Braum was just very, very meta, and he was just very good on those champions. He hasn't been anywhere since then, effectively. So these arguments don't really hold up at all. Also, again, we're talking about how fantastic what Perks did in the context of everyone's career. It's not really relevant what those Splice players did, and it doesn't downplay it at all. I actually still think, yeah, Perks failed at Worlds, and for some reason he's had a problem internationally, but he has been incredibly good. And by the way, he did solve some of that at IEM. He has been incredibly good regionally and done fantastically well. And that still deserves a lot of respect and is a very impressive accomplishment for a first-year pro. Like, Perks had a better 2016 than Febevan did in 2015. Go check out who they had on their teams, who was the main carry, who was the MVP, who actually played the best. I think when you add it all up, Perks was better, even with the international failures, where obviously Febervin, to some degree, got carried, but some degree had some good performances internationally. So this is in the same thread. It's 26 points. I think, because this was replying to a comment where like someone had made some sort of comment about like Perks' mother, so he just like bantered back like, I something on you. And then this guy, 26 points, says, I think to an extent, the factors about his personality that make him a top-level competitor are the same factors that lead him to make such replies. He will grow up and learn when to have some perspective, but that edginess needs to be fostered and tempered rather than knocked out of him. Right? I agree with both respects. The fact that he's so competitive and aggressive, even in just banter or trash talk, actually does tell me something about his personality. Like, I do think you look at how skilled he is as a player and how much he's improved and how he's really refined his individual game, and he is driven. And sometimes you're not just driven only by good things of succeeding and making people proud. You're driven because you want to beat that guy, because you can't stand the idea they're better than you. And you're driven because you want to have pride in yourself as a person, as a player, someone who's like a lot of these guys like him, their whole identity is based on how good they are at the game. So when they get very good at the game, then they can feel like they're succeeding as a person. They don't have to be like, I'm smart or I'm funny. No, I'm one of the best at the game. And you can see the fucking results there and you can't argue with it. And if you talk shit, I can talk shit back to you because I can beat you in the game and I can beat you in this realm as well. Yeah, I like that actually. And I think this is exactly a great point that he says that needs to be fostered and tempered, like put it in a more productive channels, figure out when not to say things in terms of PR so that you still retain that edge, you're still working the same way, still driven, but you don't have some of the flare-ups that some of these people can have, the Froggins, the Forgivens of the world, Soaz is. But the idea that it shouldn't be knocked out of him is a very key detail. I always tell this story, I've told many times, but I'll repeat it here. There's a story when Phil Jackson, who at the time had already won 6 NBA titles as the coach of the Bulls, came in 1999 to the LA Lakers. And the LA Lakers had one of the most talented and deep lineups in the NBA. They had Shaq, who was arguably the best player in the NBA. And then they had Kobe Bryant, who was this fantastic, he wasn't a rookie at the time, he'd been in the league a couple of years, but he was one of the fantastic rising young talents. But the problem was, Kobe Bryant was someone who already kind of wanted his grasp, his reach exceeded his grasp. He wanted more than he was capable of at that point in time. And so he was driven to try and be the best player on the team and to try and show other people up and to try and do more than he was capable of. And what's funny is an assistant coach was talking to Phil Jackson. He said something along the lines of like, oh, maybe we should like bench him some when he does these sorts of things. Or maybe we should just tell him, don't do any of that. That's not your job. You're not capable of that. And Phil Jackson said something along the lines of, no, because even though it's a problem right now, one day he will be a great player. And if we take away that edge he has now, that drive he has now, that is what will make him one of the best players one day. And so if you kind of beat that out of him, or you try and tame the wild stallion, as it were, it will never then have the same wildness, the same fire, the same force, the same spirit that it had before. And therefore you never must break that aspect. You try and foster it and harness it because you want to make use of it and you want it to exist still. And that's a key point I think we can make about Perks there. Right, so this is from a thread a while ago, actually, but I thought it's just a very good point to make because it just shows how some fans live in a fantasy land that has no bearing on reality and facts, and then will just repeat things that also have no bearing on reality and facts, and in their fantasy world, they'll even reply to each other and support each other and agree with each other, even though at no point in time was a provable fact ever the case the way that they made it. So this guy says, these are just comments with 1 point each. This guy says, Dyrus blocked Thorin on Twitter, presumably, but according to his manifesto, he would see the tweets when people retweeted them or when other people around him brought them up. And then this guy says, which is exactly what I said about and how Twitter works. You don't have to follow someone to come across their content, especially if you're following a lot of people in the same circle. Now, all of those comments there rest upon the principle, as he said there, that Dyrus had me blocked on Twitter, but then people would retweet me, and so Dyrus would see the tweets. And then that guy replies that, yeah, exactly, that's the problem with Twitter, isn't it? Well, it isn't, is it? Because everyone who uses Twitter and has any understanding of how the block function works, knows that if Dyrus has me blocked, then every one of his followers, people he follows who retweets me, he doesn't see that tweet. It doesn't show up for them because he has me blocked. That's how it works. So this is absolutely factually wrong for both Dyrus and for these fans in question. And somehow it's not just Dyrus who's incorrect. He might have just misspoken. But this fan's totally wrong. And then the guys agreed with him. And yet none of them ever understood the case. And therefore, their implication that, it's still terrible when someone makes a tweet about you. No, it isn't. You can block them and never see their tweets again. Problem solved. Enough said, right? Schooled. So... let me see. Okay, here's a good one to end on. So this was where LS did some analysis on the non-Korean teams at Worlds, and people got super mad. So this guy with 18 points says, while Korea is clearly the strongest region, I think LS tends to generalize too much. It sometimes feels like he is biased towards Korean teams purely on the basis of them being Korean, and that is simply not the right approach. Korea as a whole isn't just better. If one compares TSM or even C9 to joke teams like Jin Air and current CJ, RIP, they will certainly come to the conclusion that TSM is better. Sure, the Korean scene peak much higher, and the best Korean teams are often the best teams in the world, but discrediting Western teams and downplaying the world-class status those guys earned for themselves on the basis that they aren't Korean is just wrong. Now, even though some of the gist of what this guy says has something to it, like, yes, these teams who are Western could be better than some that are just Korean. But first of all, that's not the basis on which LS was doing this. Like, funnily enough, obviously, he was hyping Samsung, the third seed. No, he doesn't just like them just because they're Korean. He likes them because they're Korean and the best teams. Now, the fact that, like some of the world's best teams are Korean. No, actually, for the last 4 or 5 years, the best teams in the world have all been Korean. Like, you make a top 5, 3 or 4 out of the 5, if not 4 out of the 5, or 5 out of the 5 sometimes, would all be Korean. Now, this just shows how convenient the way a fan thinks and argues will be. So he doesn't like the fact that LS essentially cherry picks the top Korean teams and then contrasts them against the Western Koreans and makes it, you're shit. Then what he does is contrast the absolute best Western teams against the absolute worst LCK teams and make out like that's reasonable. So LS can't cherry pick, but you can cherry pick the fuck out of it, and in an even more extreme manner that has no reasonable context between it. I mean, that's not how as a whole works, genius. As a whole means all Korean teams against all Western teams. And guess what? The Koreans will obliterate them there. And by the way, we did actually see, when you went to IEM, etc., that teams like Kongdu could beat fucking teams from LCS. And Kongdu is objectively the worst team in LCK this split. So actually, doesn't work out at all. There's a reason why it took garbage teams like Jin Air not going with their good players to an IEM in San Jose for fucking CLG to finally beat them, or was it CSL? I think it was CLG, and therefore finally get like a win over Koreans in a best of X series. That's what it took for the West to get one. They just never got them even when you had these IEMs, etc. Yeah, so we'll end on that note. Peace.